The Neat Job by Jack Olek and narrated by Chris Harvey. Sebastian's eyes were still focused on infinity, on something that only he could see, and that something, a vision, a premonition, whatever it was, had frozen him in his seat. A man condemned to death might have sat so, and the others, respecting what he must be feeling, said nothing. Except again for Critchit. Critchit, his contemptuous smile still playing about his lips, did not share the consideration. "You look as if you've seen a ghost," he said, and somehow made the words insulting. "There are no such things as ghosts, except in magicians' illusions." Sebastian, speaking more to himself than to Critchit, completely missed Critchit's smile, but the artist did not. The artist, when Critchit turned to him and said, "And you?" regarded Critchit coldly. "Well, you're the one who started all this, so why not yours first?" "My what?" Critchit, taken aback, pretended puzzlement. But there was no mistaking the challenge that the artist flung at him. "A dream? Phobia? Obsession? Fear? Whatever you want to call it." Critchit's laugh was strained, but it died away as he became aware of the questioning stares that were being directed at him by the others. "Oh, my fear is very strange indeed." The words, sneeringly spoken, were intended to dismiss the artist's challenge, and they failed. The others still waited expectantly. In the face of their expectations, he had no choice, and despite himself, he could not suppress a small shudder as he too remembered. "Strange, strange, yes, very strange," he repeated, "but all so real. It's just so real." Wilson, Critchit noticed, was watching him with a faintly amused smile, and he found the smile annoying. Irritated, he concentrated on his task of wiping a purely imaginary stain from his water glass with his napkin, and wondered for the 10th time in as many minutes what on earth had ever possessed him to ask the man to lunch. He and Wilson had known each other ever since their school days at Eton, but they had never really had anything in common. Wilson's rather badly knotted necktie and carelessly unbuttoned jacket were proof of that, and his invitation, when they had met at the door of the restaurant, had been no more than common politeness. But Wilson had accepted, and now that the amenities had been done, the silence between them was awkward. Nor did Wilson seem inclined to break that silence. Lips twitching, he continued to watch as Critchit replaced the water glass precisely at the proper angle to his table setting, and then leaned back, relieved by the distraction, as a waiter approached their cubicle with whiskey and a siphon of soda on a tray. Critchit's relief, however, was short-lived. Even when the waiter had poured their drinks and departed, Wilson did not speak. It was Critchit, finally, who found something to say. "Well, congratulate me, Wilson. I'm going to get married." Just what he expected by way of reply he could not have said, but the reply that Wilson did make was typical of him. Small wonder that he and Wilson had never become close. The man had no conception of the proprieties. "At your age? Oh, why not?" Critchit was nettled. Still, one did not show anger if it could be avoided. Anger was an unpleasant, untidy emotion. "I've spent my whole life acquiring a fortune, a home, beautiful things. Now I need someone to take care of them, and of me. But is that so strange? Strange?" One of Wilson's eyebrows had lifted quizzically, and his tone was ironic, but Critchit did not notice. "No, I suppose not. So who's the lucky girl?" "Oh, daughter of a friend of mine, Colonel Carruthers." "Carruthers?" Astonishment momentarily replaced the irony in Wilson's voice. "Little Eleanor?" "Little Eleanor is a grown woman now, and very charming. Then why on earth should she marry you?" The question was not asked to hurt. It had been the product of honest surprise. Even Critchit knew that, and yet it stung. "A woman has to marry someone," he said coldly, "and I'm not a bad catch, even if I do say so myself. Very easy to get along with, actually." Deliberately he picked up his fork and began to polish it as he had the water glass, so that he would not have to face the new expression that had come into Wilson's eyes. He could not quite classify the expression, but it made him uneasy. "Well, wouldn't you say?" The discussion of little Eleanor was over. Wilson, irritated in turn, came close to answering Critchit's question in the negative, but such an answer would merely have made an uncomfortable moment even more uncomfortable. "Oh, of course." He raised his glass. "So to you and Helena, congratulations, and may you both find happiness," he said, and he meant it. But even as he spoke the words, he was remembering Eleanor as he had last seen her, a slight, gentle child, ever eager to please and almost pathetically grateful for even the smallest sign of approval. Eleanor and Critchit? A butterfly yoked to a wasp? Wilson sincerely hoped that she would be happy, but he doubted it. He doubted it very much. The living room of the house, like the house itself, never failed to give Critchit a little thrill of pleasure, and when he had set the record on the turntable of the hi-fi, he turned for a moment to contemplate the room with satisfaction. It was good to be in his own private world, where the disorder and the messiness that he loathed could not penetrate. The very balance of the room, the way each gleaming piece of furniture had been placed for a maximum of comfort and attractiveness, made him feel good. Content, he walked to the polished side table where he kept his glittering array of fine wines in their crystal decanters and poured himself a drink. Sipping it appreciatively, he cocked an ear for a little while toward the hi-fi, enjoying the rich, full tone of it, and then carried the drink to his favourite chair. The chair was just right. Long usage had moulded it to fit his body exactly. Automatically, he reached down to the magazine rack beside the chair and frowned. The rack was not there. Puzzled, he let his eyes roam again about the room, and frowned again when he spied the rack by the far wall. Seeing it there set a tiny flaw in the structure of his contentment, and he disliked flaws. "Eleanor?" Almost at once, Eleanor appeared from the library, smiling a little girl's smile. She had changed little, really, from what she had been as a child, and it was so that he spoke to her as though she were still a child. "You've rearranged the furniture." He did not raise his voice. If anything, he spoke even more softly than usual, but his tone was still a reproof. "Oh, yes, I thought it would look better if—" Eleanor's explanation faded uncertainly as she caught his expression. Critchit was amazed. "Why, you've rearranged the furniture," he repeated incredulously. "I reached for a magazine, and it isn't there." Just for a breath, Eleanor's face contorted slightly, but she had learned very quickly that Critchit detested displays of emotion, and the tears did not come. "Well, you must admit that it looks much nicer this way, darling," she said, and again fell silent. Critchit was staring at her as though she had taken leave of her senses. "But you've rearranged the furniture," he said for the third time. "I won't be able to find a thing." Despite herself, Eleanor's lips quivered. "Well, if it bothers you that much—" Well, of course it bothers me." Critchit's voice did rise this time, but only enough to indicate his disapproval. Eleanor was easily confused, and confused people make for more confusion. She was still, after all, rather virgin soil. She would learn. Of course it bothers me, he said again, and was not aware that he had pursed his lips, that he spoke like a schoolmaster. A place for everything, and everything in its place. That's how society is run. That's how a business is run, and that's how a home should be run. Do you understand? Yes, Arthur. By an effort of will, Eleanor controlled the trembling of her own lips. Good. Critchit nodded, sipped again from his drink, but his eyes did not leave her, and that added to her nervousness. Made awkward by his stare, she crossed the room and brought him the magazine rack. Is that better? Fine. The word was not an approval, it was a dismissal, and she left him. Again Critchit cocked an ear toward the hi-fi. Beethoven's Fifth. He always enjoyed Beethoven's Fifth, but his mind kept returning to Eleanor. Despite his appreciation of the music, despite the restored perfection of the room, she had spoiled his evening, and he resented it. Eleanor would really have to learn not to disturb the even tenor of his way of life. Still, as the music swelled and the evening progressed, he was able to put the incident out of his thoughts. Eleanor did not disturb him again. He was able to read in peace until he was deliciously weary and ready for bed. He looked forward to that. He took an almost sensuous delight in fresh, crisp sheets, and one of the first things that he had taught Eleanor was that their bed linen had to be changed every day, and no exceptions. His lips pursed again in the expression that was so typical of him, and of which he was completely unaware. He hoped that she had not forgotten. He need not have been concerned, however. Eleanor was asleep when he entered the bedroom, but the sheets and the pillowcase on his side of the huge double bed were fresh and unmarred. She slept curled up like a puppy, but she had remembered. Even asleep, she kept to her own side of the bed, so that his side would not be disturbed. That pleased him. So much, in fact, that he looked down at her with something that almost resembled affection before he undressed and slipped under the coverlet. Content again, he was asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. So, of course, he did not know that Eleanor was not really asleep at all. He had no idea, while he snored softly, that she lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness with her eyes damp. Just as, in the morning, he had no idea that she was watching him from under lowered lids when he awoke, refreshed and eager for the day, and went to the bathroom to shower and shave. He had slept well, exceedingly well, and the events of last night had been forgotten. Presently, wisps of steam appeared around the bathroom door as he turned on the shower. Then suddenly his voice filled the bedroom. He had, actually, a rather pleasant baritone, but he sang off-key and too loudly, and his choice of songs was hardly a considerate one. Rule Britannia, bellowed at 7 in the morning, was jarring. In the bedroom, Eleanor made a small grimace. Just the same, she smiled at him when he emerged from the bathroom, freshly shaved and wearing a dressing gown. 6 months of marriage had already taught her many things, and one of those things was that Critchit expected her to be cheerful and pleasant at all times. "Well, you're up. Good morning, dear." Critchit was in a high good humour. He was roaring Rule Britannia again when he went to the chest of drawers and opened it, even throwing in an occasional bum-ti-bum-bum. But he did not really see her smile of greeting. Dressing was a serious business to him, and even as he reached into the drawer that held his underthings, he was mentally selecting his wardrobe for the day. The blue tweed, perhaps, and that new double-knit shirt. A sound behind him made him turn. Eleanor was sitting up in bed and staring at him, and she was laughing. Laughing? At him? It made no sense, until he looked down at himself. Even as he was making his mental selection, he had slipped into the garment that he had taken from the drawer and then removed his dressing gown, and suddenly his face was grim. The picture that he made was humorous, but not to him. Instead of his usual shorts, he was wearing a pair of Eleanor's lacy panties. His expression as he redonned his dressing gown and stripped off the panties wiped the amusement from her face as if with a sponge. Holding the panties, he came to stand beside her, his eyes icy. "What's this?" "They're," her own eyes pleaded, "they're mine." "You don't say!" The inanity of her reply rasped across his nerves like a file. But patience. "Oh, what are they doing in my drawer?" "Well, I moved your things to your side of the bed." To Eleanor, as she waved a hand to indicate the dresser at the other side of the room, what she said obviously made eminent sense, and that grated on him too. "Oh, I see. But I've always kept my shorts in this drawer, right here on the left, folded in half, buttons up." He spoke through his teeth, but patiently. It was no use. Eleanor's stare was vague, almost uncomprehending. How can one live in disorder? His patience was at an end. Her vacant stare was too much. "I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't set things right. There's a right way and a wrong way to do everything." How would he teach her? The way she kept staring at him, as though he were an ogre. She had no conception of the importance of what he was saying. Somewhere he had read that children learnt best not by being taught, but by being shown. One picture is worth 1,000 words, and she was still, despite her woman's body, despite the gold band on her finger, very much a child. "I'll show you," he said, and turned toward the bedroom door. "Come along." Chastened and obedient, Eleanor left the bed at once, and not even pausing to find her slippers, followed him downstairs to the cellar door. Together they made a grim little courtiers of silence, but when Critchit had led the way down the wooden cellar stairs and switched on a light, his face relaxed somewhat. Here at least, all was as it should be. The cellar, immaculately clean, had been divided into two halves. In one stood the boiler and the odds and ends that he had accumulated over the years. In the other stood his workshop, and the workshop, at least to him, was a joy to behold. Complete with power tools, bench and shelves of jars containing almost anything that a home handyman might need, it reflected his personality even more perfectly than did the rest of the house. "My workshop," he said unnecessarily. Eleanor had seen the workshop before, but he spoke as if she were setting eyes on it for the first time. For his purposes, indeed, she was seeing it for the first time. Eleanor, he was quite certain, had never really looked at the workshop. Certainly she had never looked at it as he did, appreciating its orderliness. "Look, I love to make things. It relaxes me, but—" He looked directly into her eyes. "But I couldn't make anything at all if I didn't keep my tools and my screws and my bolts and nuts filed away neatly. Now could I?" "No, Arthur." His hand indicated the jars neatly arrayed on their shelves like soldiers on parade. "Nails by sizes and lengths, screws by kind, size, thread, diameter. I know where everything is. All I have to do is reach out my hand and find it. And that's the value of neatness." "Yes, Arthur." Eleanor was hanging her head. He left it at that. There was no need to belabor the point. This time he was sure Eleanor had absorbed her lesson, and it would not do to be late at his office. One had to set an example for one's employees. "Well, see that you remember in future." Upstairs, afterward, he dressed with his usual care. Blue tweed trousers, white shirt and dark blue tie, blue socks. At the clothes closet he paused for a moment, sniffing. A faint aroma of sizzling bacon had seeped into the room from the kitchen below, and it made his mouth water. He always had a hearty appetite in the morning. Momentarily distracted, he reached down for his shoes and was seated on the bed, just putting them on, when Eleanor came into the bedroom. "Well, breakfast is ready." Her smile was contrite. "Will you be down soon?" The smile that he gave her in turn was without warmth. "In a minute." He had finished putting on his shoes, and as he spoke he was walking again to the clothes closet. The blue jacket that matched his trousers was in his hands when she heard his sigh from the door and turned to see him shaking his head. The sigh alerted her at once. "What is it?" "This closet." He was looking at the closet as though it contained a nest of vipers. "These clothes. Hangers should all hook over the rod from the front, and yours should all hang facing the same way. Or is that too much to expect?" The question required no answer, and she offered none. But her lips quivered anew. He did not notice. Still shaking his head, he slipped into the jacket and, in front of the full-length mirror, tugged at the ends of it until it hung without pulls or wrinkles. Then, satisfied, he started to turn away from the mirror and froze. He was wearing brown shoes. Stunned by the enormity of his discovery, he glared at her, his face crimson. "You put a pair of brown shoes among my black ones. If I'd got out like this—" But that was an eventuality that he did not even dare to contemplate. Heavily, angrily, he reseated himself on the bed and began to tug the offending shoes from his feet. "Will you never learn to be neat? Can't you absorb anything? Brown shoes on that shelf, black below. My shoes on this side, yours on that. How many times must I tell you?" His lips writhed, hurled his words at her like missiles. "This house! It must be neat!" In a moment he would be shouting. He fought down the impulse and mastered it. "Yes, Arthur." Eleanor was shaking, great tears welling from the corners of her eyes. When he bent to tie his shoelaces, she fled. He let her go. Minutes later, when he came down for breakfast, he was himself again. Eleanor served him in silence, and in silence he consumed what she set before him. He could even, before he left, set a lukewarm kiss on her forehead. Then he was gone. Alone, Eleanor sat for more than an hour at the table, not touching the coffee that she had poured for herself. Despite all her efforts, she was still trembling, and eventually the tears came again. She wept quietly. Afterward, her eyes were red when she kept her lunch and appointment. Such appointments were all that she had with which to fill her empty days, and she'd been looking forward to this one. But her attempt to conceal her tension when she sat in the restaurant was almost painfully transparent, particularly when, inevitably, the conversation turned to the subject of her marriage. The woman opposite her name was Jane, and she and Eleanor were old friends, spoke quite bluntly. "Why on earth did you marry him, Eleanor?" Eleanor, pretty in a new dress despite her reddened eyes, considered her reply for a long time. "Father had no money, and I had no abilities, no profession. What else could I do? Besides, he's very nice, really. Except for what?" It was difficult to put it into words, to say it right out, but, well, there's nothing I seem to be able to do for him except to keep his house tidy. "So you're not happy then?" "I didn't say that." Instantly, Eleanor was defensive, but the woman who sat opposite her had known her too long and too well to be deceived. "Well, of course you didn't." A hand patted Eleanor's comfortingly. "The first year is always the hardest, especially when the wife has no outside interests." Jane broke off, struck by a thought. She was really fond of Eleanor, and the poor dear really looked as though she needed some sort of distraction. "Look, I've got an idea. I'm attending a class in modern sculpture. Why don't you come along? Learn to make something for him. Perhaps a birthday surprise." "Make something? For Arthur?" Eleanor was recalling Critchit's lecture in the cellar. He liked to make things too. Perhaps if she were to share in his hobby. She smiled suddenly, brightly, a child again, a child who has offended an elder and has unexpectedly found the perfect way to make amends. Yes, why not? So that was that. A few days later, she hummed as she worked at Critchit's workbench. She had, surprisingly, managed to make considerable progress, and she was almost happy. The piles of rods, nuts and bolts, and assorted pieces of metal with which she had begun would, presently, make quite a presentable piece of modern sculpture. Critchit would be delighted. The piping notes made by the cuckoo that had suddenly popped out of the clock on the wall had distracted her. 5 o'clock? So soon? A glance at her wristwatch confirmed the hour. Critchit would be returning for dinner before too long, and it would not do to have him discover her surprise before it was ready. It would not do at all. Smiling, she carried the sculpture to a small curtain-covered alcove at the other end of the cellar, and when she had drawn the curtain to conceal the sculpture, returned to the workbench. Carefully, painstakingly, she returned the bits of hardware that she had left on the bench to their respective jars, every bolt and screw, just as Critchit had taught her. There! No signs of her labours remained. Even Critchit would have been pleased, just as she was certain he would be pleased when she finally produced her completed gift. But that was yet to come. She made certain, in the days that followed, to give him no cause for complaint, and he had no inkling of what she was up to. In time, mollified by her attention to the details of housekeeping, he became almost jovial. It was a full 2 weeks before he felt again the need to reprimand her. It began on a Sunday, with his almost nightly ritual at the hi-fi. Critchit, on that day, had played his usual 18 holes of golf, and he had not bothered, on his return, to seek her out. He was in a mellow mood, and such a mood required music. From the garage, he had gone directly to the set in its rich walnut cabinet. Now, as he made his choice of records, he pursed his lips characteristically. Beethoven again? No, his mood called for something lighter, more airy. Italian, perhaps? Yes. Carefully, he drew the proper record from the rack, and just as carefully removed the record from its sleeve and then from its cover, holding it by its edges and by the hole at its centre so that his fingers would not touch its surface. He had done the same thing 1,000 times, but there was a satisfaction in it, in the rightness of it, that increased when he set the record on its turntable and, with a small brush, flicked away from its face and from the hi-fi needle the dust that was not really there. Even pressing the start button was a joy. The small, clean click that it made was a punctuation mark to a task well done. Satisfied, he turned away from the set as the music filled the room, and saw Eleanor. She had been there all the time, a book on her lap, but she had watched in silence, not wanting to disturb him. He recognised the fact instantly, and was pleased by that too. So much so that when she started to her feet, he stopped her with a gesture and smiled expansively. No, you sit right there, darling." Eleanor had really been a very good girl. She deserved a reward. "I'll get dinner. I used to do quite a lot of cooking for myself, I'm quite a chef, actually." For a moment she seemed about to protest. It was a wife's duty to prepare her husband's meals. But Critchit was already leaving the room. "You just relax," he said, and for once his smile was warm. Grateful for even so small a comfort, she settled back. She could hear him a little while later in the kitchen. He was singing again, in time with the music, and his off-key baritone made her own smile a reflection of his. It was just as she had told Jane. Critchit was very nice, really. If he was sometimes short with her, well, that was just his way. A man had a right to his idiosyncrasies, didn't he? Everything would work out. All she had to do was keep Critchit happy, and she would be happy too. And Critchit was indeed happy. Arrayed in a white apron and a chef's tall hat, he stood over the range and watched as the spaghetti that he had immersed in an oversized pot came to the boil. Beside it, a batch of mushrooms simmered in their saucepan as they sauteed in butter almost done. Before turning to the vegetable cupboard behind him, he shook the saucepan gently by its handle, just once to spread the butter evenly over them. It was near sacrilege to poke mushrooms about as they cooked. It ruined their flavour. Now, tomatoes. There were asparagus, leeks, carrots, potatoes, onions. The cupboard was full, almost to overflowing, but there were no tomatoes. Instantly, his mellow mood was gone. Not yet really angry, he turned to another cupboard, but with a pair of suddenly materialized lines etching vertical furrows between his eyes. Oh well, perhaps tomato puree. The second cupboard was stacked with row upon row of tins, neatly as in a supermarket, but it contained no tomato puree. To make certain, he ran his finger along the neat rows. Tomato ketchup? Tomato soup? The finger halted. Where there should have been tomato puree, there was empty space. His hand, when he took it away, was shaking. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to hold his temper in check, but he had not yet reached the limits of his patience. Spaghetti sauce would have to do. He was not overly fond of spaghetti sauce, but he had no choice. At still another cupboard he ran his finger again along a row of tins. Curry, paprika, chili. For the second time his finger stabbed empty space. Oh my God! There was then no denying the fury that welled up in him. It was in every line of his body, in his eyes, in his voice, when he shouted, "Eleanor!" He almost screamed the name, not knowing and not caring that the sound of it startled Eleanor, so that she literally leapt from her chair and was already hurrying towards the kitchen, even before he shouted again, "Eleanor!" Quaking, she remained standing just inside the kitchen door as he glared at her. Whatever her latest transgression, it was all too obviously unforgivable. Critchit was livid. No tomatoes, no tomato sauce, no spaghetti sauce, nothing! Each word was bitten off, his teeth clamping down on it savagely. He was no longer shouting, but this savage, clipped monotone was even worse. The warm flush of happiness that had bathed her for a little while was gone, and in its place was the old familiar tension that made her hands shake so that she clasped them together in front of her in an effort to keep them still. I must have forgotten. Vainly, even knowing that he would not accept it, she sought for some explanation, but found none. But there's no excuse for forgetting. Critchit's voice was heavy with accusation. Dramatically, accenting each motion he made, he swung wide the door of the cabinet beside which he stood. Affixed to the inner side of the door was a sheet of paper. Not looking at the paper, his eyes still fastened on hers, he went on. Look, there's a list inside the door of this cupboard. There's a line on it for every item of every kind. And there's an eraser on the bottom of the shelf. When you use an item, all you have to do is erase a mark. There should never be an empty space. He paused as if for effect, but Eleanor was speechless, not knowing what she was expected to say. Her dumb helplessness enraged him even more. There are 2 marks here for tomato puree, 3 for spaghetti sauce. You haven't even bothered. He had been turning as he spoke, his hands sweeping to indicate the cupboard, and even as he spoke the hand brushed against the stacks of tins, upsetting them. The crash that followed brought Eleanor out of her near hypnosis, as though it had been a gunshot. But for a moment, as tins bounced and rolled on the kitchen floor, she seemed unable to move, and when her muscles responded to her will at last, she stepped forward like an automaton. On hands and knees, she began to gather up the tins. Another man, seeing her so, might have felt at least a twinge of remorse. Critchit felt only his anger. The kitchen door, slamming behind him as he went out, rattled the room. For the rest of the evening he did not speak to Eleanor. In time, finished in the kitchen, she sought him out and found him in the living room, listening sourly to another record. But her overtures, her attempts to strike up a conversation, to make him speak, anything to lessen the feeling of guilt that gnawed at her, were fruitless. Eventually, still without speaking, he left the house, and she guessed that he had gone out for his dinner, and that deepened her guilt still further. He did not know when he returned hours later how she had spent those hours, how she had vowed that from this day on he would have no cause for complaint. Surly and unforgiving, he undressed and went to bed, and in the morning left before she awoke. She was not really asleep, of course, but he did not guess that. Nor would it have mattered if he had. Critchit was thoroughly disgusted. So much so that toward the end of the day he had his secretary call Eleanor to tell her that he would not be home until late. Still ruffled, he dined out, and then attended a musical that he did not enjoy, and came home to find that she had already retired. He did not look at her. Had he bothered, he would have seen that her pillow was wet with her crying. Instead, he went back downstairs to make certain that the latches on the doors and the windows of the lower floor were all locked. To his surprise, they were. Eleanor had not forgotten. At least there was something to which she had given the proper attention. Even so, he did not emerge from his black mood. In the morning, for once not splashing and singing, he showered in dour silence and returned to the bedroom to find Eleanor already up and out of the room. So she thought to escape him, did she? Well, he would see about that. Dressed and ready for the street, he came downstairs to the living room like an avenging angel. "Eleanor?" The living room was unoccupied. His irritation growing again, he stared at it as if to materialize Eleanor by the sheer force of will. It would be like her to hide, to have gone out in an effort to avoid facing him, to avoid the just consequences of her incompetence. But when he found her, his nostrils twitched. Eleanor had not gone out, after all. A tantalizing odour from the kitchen drew him like a magnet. Well, he could not, for a moment, believe his eyes. The kitchen, always spotless, positively gleamed. Counters and floor had been scrubbed and polished until they shone, and that was not all. Fresh coffee perked cheerily on the range, and on the table in the breakfast nook stood an array of dishes that delighted his gourmet's heart. Not just bacon and eggs this time, but a breakfast fit for a king. Eleanor, freshly made up and wearing a starched pristine little apron, smiled up at him. "Good morning, dear." There was still a hint of uneasiness behind her smile, but the uneasiness vanished as he looked around the kitchen. Critchit was honestly impressed. You did all this? Last night?" Eleanor's smile seemed to be glued in place. His answering smile was her reward. "How splendid! How absolutely splendid!" Critchit did not complete the sentence. Is something wrong, dear?" "Well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it?" Thoughtfully, Critchit crossed to the cupboard where the checklist hung and opened it. The shelves inside were full, unmarred by empty spaces, and a number of new erasures had been made on the checklist. Delighted, he turned back to her. "All correct, eh?" At her nod, the last of the shadows fled from his eyes. Almost impulsively, he kissed her and murmured, "Darling." Eleanor was trying. He could afford to be magnanimous, and the breakfast she had prepared did look extraordinarily delicious. It was in fact superb. There was deep satisfaction in his voice as he spread his napkin on his lap and buttered his toast. What a beautiful, smashing breakfast. And just when I need a good one too. I've got a busy day ahead of me. For a breath he paused, considered. Eleanor was watching him, pleased because he was pleased, but still a trifle tense, still a trifle apprehensive. His next words were her forgiveness. I'll be home at 6, though, as usual. The tension in Eleanor relaxed. He could almost see it happen. Smiling, she served him, and smiling saw him to the door and watched him drive off. The kitchen, when she left it later to return to her project, was in perfect order. Not a crumb, not a dish, not a speck marred its perfection. She would be a good wife. Her misery of the past 2 days forgotten, she could look forward again to the moment when she could present her surprise to Critchit and see the pleasure come into his eyes. Her sculpture was close to completion now, and she could hardly wait. But there was, of course, still a great deal that she had to do before that happy moment arrived. She had, despite all her efforts, found the project more difficult than she had anticipated, and the hours flew by unnoticed as she worked in the cellar. It was a shock, finally, when the cuckoo again chirped 5 times and she realised that most of the day was gone. Frowning with concentration, the tip of her tongue protruding slightly from between her teeth, she examined what she had done. The latest rod that she had affixed to the sculpture was not set at quite the right angle that she had wanted. Best to adjust it right now. It would only take a few minutes. It was a mistake. She did not, in her concentration, hear the cuckoo chirp again an hour later, nor did she hear the sound of Critchit's car when he drove into the driveway at exactly the same moment. Even as she worked, Critchit was entering the front door of the house. Ordinarily she would have been there to greet him, but on this occasion at least he chose not to be irritated by the fact that she was not. Still glowing with the experience of the morning, he smiled and went into the kitchen. She was probably there, busy with his dinner. Not finding it in the kitchen made his smile a little crooked, set an edge to it. But when he returned to the living room, he was still more puzzled than upset. She had to be somewhere. But where? The cellar? The cellar door, he could see, was slightly ajar, but Eleanor rarely went down to the cellar. He took 3 steps down the cellar stairs, stopped on the 4th and drew in his breath. His smile disappeared. Eleanor was doing something at the workbench. He could not see what it was that occupied her, but he could see the rest of the workshop clearly. The workshop was a shambles. Nuts, bolts of metal, open jars, tools, all were scattered about with complete disregard for the order that until this moment had been the hallmark of this, his private domain. It was almost indecent. It would take hours to restore the shop to its previous state. Hours! And he had been fool enough to believe that he had at last made progress, that Eleanor had at last come to have at least some understanding of the importance of neatness. Purposely, wanting to startle her, he cleared his throat loudly, and he succeeded. Until that moment she had been completely unaware of him. Now, at the sound, she started violently and dropped the tools with which she had been working. Her face, when she turned toward him, was white with shock. But Critchit no longer had eyes for her. His own eyes were fixed disbelievingly on the sculpture that sat on his workbench. "What on earth is that?" Fear, surprise, and a child's pride in a cherished accomplishment fought for dominance in her voice. The fear won. It's a surprise." He came down the rest of the cellar stairs in silence, his unbelieving eyes still fixed on the sculpture. "Oh, I'll say it is. What have you done to my workshop?" Almost she plucked at his sleeve, wanting him to look at her and not at the sculpture, wanting him to understand, and she did not dare. "I'm sorry, Arthur. I tidy it after each time He did look at her then, and his look silenced her. "You mean that this has been going on for some time?" Incredible. She was really incredible. "Clear it up at once." "But—" "Yes?" Was she actually going to argue with him? "Yes? Well?" Her reply made no sense to him. No sense at all. "I made it to try to please you, Arthur. Don't be angry. I've been going to classes." "Classes? When you were supposed to be attending to really important things?" It was too much. It really was. He towered above her, and as he spoke she looked away from his terrible eyes, let her chin drop until it was resting on her breast. "Now you listen to me, girl. This is my house. It has always been my house, and I want it as it always has been, neat and tidy and exactly as I've been used to having it. You will please me by keeping everything in its proper place. Now take apart that horrible thing and put every bit back where it was." Crushed, she did not move. It was as if she heard him from a distance, as if what he said were unreal. But it was real. He left no doubt of that when he turned on his heel and went back up the stairs, pausing only for a moment to look back. "Well?" Blinded again, as so often before her tears, she went to the workbench and began to return the bits and pieces that she had scattered everywhere to their jars. It took a long time, thanks to the shaking of her hands. Half a dozen times pieces fell from her fingers, but at last the workbench was clear except for the sculpture. Long after Critchit had vanished, she began to dismantle it. This piece here, in this jar, this piece in that jar. Suddenly, she put her hands over her face and began to sob uncontrollably. Critchit, when she finally went back upstairs, was not in the house, nor did she see him again the next morning. He was gone when she awakened. For once she had slept deeply, suddenly, as though hiding from her unhappiness. But even finding herself alone was a small solace. Critchit would return. Not bothering with coffee, she dressed and went about her chores like a sleepwalker. At least the chores were something to do, something to distract her from the inner trembling and uncertainty that would not let her be still, that made her hands quiver and her legs like jelly. But by late afternoon she could find nothing more that needed attention. Beaten down and frightened, she sat finally in a chair in the living room, not listening to the record that she had put on the hi-fi, an unread magazine lying on the floor at her feet, and stared at nothing. Never particularly attracted by liquor, she had mixed herself a drink that stood now on the table beside her. Automatically she picked it up and then set it back on the table without drinking, and gasped. She had set the drink back on the table itself instead of on its coaster, and there was a wet ring on the polished wood. Frantic, she looked around the room for something with which to wipe away the telltale ring and found nothing. Sobbing, she pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve. No use. Wipe as she would, the ring remained, and she could see the clock on the mantel. It was 5:45. "He'll be back at 6. The words were a moan. Completely disorganized, she started toward the cellar door. Somewhere in the cellar would be a container of furniture polish. And then, distracted, she raced to the hi-fi. Critchit would be furious if he knew that she had touched his precious set. Thinking of that set her hands to trembling even more violently, so that the hi-fi needle, when she lifted the arm from the record, dropped from her grasp. It bounced on the record and screeched as it scratched across the black surface. His record! No! Oh no! In the sudden silence she stood irresolute. Then, overwhelmed by panic, she fled, out of the living room and down the cellar stairs. A rag! She had to have a rag. There, in the bin, with the word rags lettered on it. Now, polish. Dear God, where was the furniture polish? There was none. She was enmeshed in a nightmare, one of those terrifying dreams in which the sleeper is in mortal danger and can only move in slow motion. Except that this was not a nightmare, not a dream. It was real. Her mouth opened and closed. "Please, oh please." At last, a bottle of furniture polish stood on a rack with other bottles. Clutching it and the rag, she flew back up the stairs. A few more moments, only a few more, and Critchit would be coming to the front door. In the living room, she scrubbed at the ring like a mad woman. It was stubborn, unyielding, but it faded, little by little, little by little. Done. It was done. No trace remained to mar the polished surface of the table. She was safe. She stepped back, sick with relief, and felt a heel touch the bottle of furniture polish that she had set down on the floor, saw the viscous liquid that gushed from its open mouth to spread in a widening puddle on the carpet. Oh, God! The rag would not soak up the puddle. The rag, wet and cold, was like a handful of worms. There had to be a way. Moaning, she ran to where a small rug covered the floor at the door to the living room. Dragging it, she returned and flung it over the stain. Perhaps Critchit would not notice. Perhaps. A hum brought her around with her hysterical eyes seeking. The hi-fi. She had forgotten to switch off the hi-fi. Turn it off. Quickly. Dad. Close the cabinet. Look around. Make certain that nothing mars the order of the room. The magazine. It still lay on the floor. Put it back. There. No, not that way, with its cover facing out. Critchit was insistent on that. Every magazine should sit in the rack with its cover facing toward his chair. The nightmare was over. Everything was in its place. Sighing, she turned for one last look around the room, not knowing that she looked almost insane, that she was on the verge of collapse. For one brief moment her eyes cleared, but only until, across the room from her, the picture crashed from the wall. The picture, like some prop in a movie, chose precisely that instant in which to pull its nail from the plaster, to smash down on the floor, to shatter its glass into 1,000 shards. She began to giggle hysterically, but she still fell to her knees. She still began to pick up the razor-sharp fragments with her bare hands, so that she cut herself and blood ran from her palm. She was still able to look at the clock on the mantel, 5:55. She had 5 minutes, 5 minutes in which to rehang the picture. A nail! God in heaven, where was the nail? She could not find it, and she would need a hammer. Muttering, sobbing, gasping, she ran again to the cellar stairs. On the stairs she stumbled and almost fell, saving herself only by clutching at the stair rail, and then continued her near-drunken career the rest of the way down and so to the workbench. Blindly, not even seeing it, she tore a hammer from its place among Critchit's other tools before running her hands shakily along the rows of jars on their shelves. The first jar that she opened held nails that were almost the size of spikes. They would not do. And the next contained nails that were too small. Her mutterings and sobbings became a gurgle of pure frustration. It was as if fate itself were deliberately guiding her hands to the wrong jars, as if she were meant to be discovered. This wasn't fair. It wasn't right. A gurgle became a moan. Her hands would no longer obey her. They seemed to have acquired a crazy, shaking life of their own. After what seemed an eternity, and was only seconds, she found the proper jar and tugged at it, only to find that it was wedged in between its companions on right and left. What followed was inevitable. The shelves, heavily laden, were easily unbalanced. Only a little effort was required to pull them off their centre of gravity, and she was, in her fear, exerting every ounce of her strength. As if, in a continuation of a waking nightmare, she saw the shelves tip toward her, totter precariously for a moment, and then continue downward, gathering speed as they fell. The crashing explosion of the jars on the concrete cellar floor seemed to sound in her head rather than at her feet. Instinctively, not even knowing that she did so, she had stepped back out of harm's way, but the explosion drove the last ounce of self-control from her mind, tore into shreds what little sanity she still possessed. For a few hysterical moments she tried again on her knees to make some order out of the chaos, but it was no good. There was no time, and there was still in her that nagging fear that was now all that motivated her. There was something she had to do, to find. There was some reason why she had come down here. The picture! The picture! The chaos was no longer her primary concern. A nail in one fist and the hammer in the other, her legs carrying her unsteadily, she ran back up the cellar stairs. And it was there, suddenly, unexpectedly, terrifyingly, that a pair of hands seized her. The hands were there, waiting as she emerged from the cellar, and the touch of them wrenched an involuntary cry from her open mouth, almost stopped her wildly beating heart. "Eleanor!" The hands belonged to Critchit. Critchit, who stood now with hangry spots of colour burning in his cheeks, with fury in his eyes and with accusation in every line of his stance, as he stared past her through the open cellar door at the mess below. I wanted to hang a picture. I came down here for a nail." Her lips formed the words, but she was only vaguely aware that she spoke. The words were reflex, no more, and they were wasted. Critchit was the very epitome of outrage, the new plus ultra of shocked indignation, an all too real manifestation of everything that she had come to dread. "You've upset my whole house. Can't you do anything neatly? Well, can't you? Can't you do anything neatly? Can't you do anything neatly?" Critchit wanted to shake her, to slap her, but he did neither of those things. She did not give him the opportunity. Her wild, howling, insane scream was the last thing he heard. The hammer that she held was the last thing he saw. Frozen, unable to stare, he saw her arm lift, saw the hammer sweep downward and grow incredibly larger as it approached his head. The hammer struck him squarely between the eyes. It compressed the bone of his forehead, squeezed his eyes out of their sockets, plunged on. It etched an invisible spiderweb of cracks in his skull, drove splinters of bone into his brain, and then smashed what was left of his brain into a mass of dead grey matter into which blood seeped as if into a bowl of porridge. He managed a single scream, a mate to Eleanor's, and then he was no more. Carefully, holding it by the extreme end of its handle, Eleanor carried the hammer back downstairs, took a rag from the bin and wiped the hammer spotlessly clean. Then, when she had returned the hammer to its proper place, she turned her attention to the rest of the workroom. It really was a mess. Humming, she set about putting it to rights. The cellar was in perfect order again when she sat by the workbench hours later and talked to the police inspector. He had come in answer to her call, together with 2 policemen, and one of the policemen stood now beside her and the other at the head of the cellar stairs. But it was to the inspector that she spoke. He was a very understanding man. "And that's how it happened," she said, and looked about her, satisfied. He said I couldn't do anything neatly, but I showed him. I cleaned it up. I cleaned up everything when I was finished, all neat and tidy, a place for everything and everything in its place." Despite himself, the inspector shuddered when she began to laugh. The laugh was incongruous, issuing from the lips of a young woman who somehow managed even now to look like a little girl. An insane, cackling laugh without rhyme or reason. It made his hair stand on end. But Eleanor had no inkling of that. She was still laughing when she turned her head so that she could see the jars that she had so carefully returned to their shelves. Every broken jar had been replaced, and in her pleasure at a task well done, She did not even hear when the inspector walked to the jars and made a small retching sound and turned away, unable to look at them. She had done a really excellent job. Critchit would have been really proud of her. It was all very neat. She had even made up a set of labels for the new jars. The contents of each of the jars could be readily identified by her small, childish script. Heart, small intestines, large intestines, lungs, fingers, toes, pancreas, ears, nose. The artist's smiling, sunburned face swam vaguely before Critchit, so that he brushed a hand over his eyes, not recollecting for the moment where he was. Then, remembering, his own face went stiff. The artist's smile was as derisive as his own had been earlier. The artist, enjoying his discomfiture, lit a cigarette and tossed his dead match on the table. "And are you neat and tidy?" "No more than any other man." Ill at ease, Critchit picked up the dead match and dropped it into an ashtray, and was unaware that the unconscious gesture made the artist smile the wider. He was no longer thinking of the artist in any case. And yet what? Rogers at least was not smiling. Critchit shrugged. This was all nonsense. "Oh, it's nothing, it's just a recurrent dream." But why that one? The artist, tenacious, clung to his advantage. Why that particular nightmare? Blast the man. He was being deliberately obnoxious. Critchit's temper, controlled though it was, sounded in his voice. "Now, it's not my nightmare, is it, that you're really concerned about? It's yours, isn't it?" So venomously was it said that the artist recoiled, but it was Critchit's turn now to be tenacious. "What about your story, eh?" "My story?" The artist spoke under his breath, hesitantly, as though marshalling his thoughts, and those thoughts mirrored themselves in his eyes. His eyes were suddenly hard. "Mine begins on an island, a tropical island. The island of Haiti." Arthur Critchit's story, The Neat Job, was written by Jack Olek and narrated, sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming very soon, stay tuned for the final fateful tale from the chilling depths of the Vault of Horror, from where I will be bringing you Frank Moore's fateful story, Drawn and Quartered, wherein an angry, embittered artist seeks a somewhat original and creative, indeed artistic, method of justice and revenge by means of voodoo, and a method truly painted in blood.